Kevin. That was a wonderful introduction. This is indeed one of my favorite topics. And tonight I want to talk about Mary Ball Washington, not simply as George's mother, but as a historical figure in her own right. One whose reputation has been shaped less by what she did than by creative storytelling. This is a talk about evidence, but as importantly, it is a talk about historical narrative. How we choose to remember Mary says a lot about us. And when I first started working at Ferry Farm back in 2008, that was Washington's boyhood home, it didn't even occur to me that George had parents. It didn't much matter to me. And as I read the biographies that were pretty critical of Mary, it's just like, parenting isn't easy. I can see maybe, it wasn't for Mary. I could sympathize with maybe she wasn't such a great mom. But as I was studying the artifacts that were being uncovered at Ferry Farm, they were in strong contrast with those biographers of George Washington. So I was really inspired. Now, before we get started properly, I want to share a little self-promotion. Friends tell me I don't do this often enough. In the edited volume, The Buried Cause, co-author Leah Lane and I analyzed 2 carved wooden artifacts made from the Empress tree that's by Stonewall Jackson's grave in Lexington, Virginia. And those carved wooden objects, along with a lot of other things, were buried in a cornerstone of the Lee statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond. And so this book, each chapter, and if you want to, you can come up and take a look at it afterwards, covers items that were in that cornerstone. And it's a collection of blogs, actually, so they're pretty short and sweet. So I invite you to come up and take a look at that. Maybe look more into the book itself. And then Kevin mentioned the article Trust for Success from Winterthur Portfolio. It was the Winterthur Journal gave it an award, actually, and we found hundreds of wig hair curlers at Ferry Farm. It appears that the Washingtons in the 1760s are curling wig hair for the Washington boys. There you see Samuel Washington, George's brother. He's wearing a wig. It's very clear he's wearing a wig, and it might be a wig made from his own hair. Given the color of it. It would have been less expensive to maintain wigs at home, and given that ferry road crossed right through their property, people are catching the ferry to Fredericksburg, they likely had customers walking down that road that took advantage of the enslaved hairdresser that was doing all this work. So tonight, I'm going to talk briefly about who Mary Washington was using what we can actually document. And then I'm going to show how over time, Washington's mother became a 2-dimensional character in George's biographies, and typically a difficult or embarrassing one for George. Then I'm going to show how the few remaining documentary records that have survived matter, because that's where Mary's decisions, her agency, is expressed. And then finally, I'm going to share a hypothesis I have about Mary's signature. There's lots of documents that show her signature. There's a lot of variety in her signature. And I worked hard to try to find which one was actually hers. Not certain if I'd be able to determine that for certain, but I think I have. And I think there's something kind of interesting about it. So many of you here are experts in Richmond history. I gave this talk last month in New York for their celebration of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But that audience was a very different one. And I know there's a lot of experts here on the Washingtons, on Fredericksburg, and on various topics that I'm going to touch on here. Feel free to ask a question during it. Feel free to react. You can save questions for afterwards if you want, but I'm not going to mind if you want to augment this presentation and make it more of a dialogue. Okay, so Washington's myth-making came early, even before Parson Weems's early biography. And Washington has long been revered, and with good reason. We can thank John Adams for an early tale of Washington's supernatural origins. Adams was challenged by Washington's popularity. He was a hero to Americans. Written in a private letter to Benjamin Rush during Washington's lifetime, Adams shared with a close friend his notion of Washington's supernatural origins. Adams imagined that Benjamin Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and out sprang George Washington. But Adams wasn't done. In 1807, Adams' resentment of Washington's popularity remained incandescent. He penned this letter to his friend Benjamin Rush in 1807, 8 years after Washington's death. And in the letter, Adams satirically described Washington's talents, which included a handsome face, a tall stature, graceful attitudes and movement, and a large, imposing fortune. Adams added that Washington was a Virginian, and that is equivalent to 5 talents. Yeah. Now, while biographers since Adams' 1790 musings have produced less far-fetched origins, they have nonetheless taken considerable liberties in their accounts of Washington's life, sometimes at the expense of those who supported his development and success. Now, I'm an archaeologist. When I was in my 20s, I supervised archaeological projects in Pennsylvania and New York. And every state provides guidelines. When you write up your archaeological site, there are certain guidelines that you have to meet. And in both Pennsylvania and New York, every report, you might be writing a report about a pre-contact Native American village, but that report has to provide a historical background that says how many times Washington crossed that county. And as a Virginian from Northern Virginia, this was really amusing, because who could calculate that in Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, Stafford County? So I just found that really amusing, and that's stuck with me for all my life. And I think as Virginians, especially with a lot of colonial history, there's a lot we take for granted that's really special here, and especially where George is concerned. So I've studied Washington for 17, 18 years using historical documents, biographies, and studying the artifacts recovered from his homes here in Virginia. And over the past century, Washington biographers are typically unkind to his mother, Mary. These depictions have been repeated so many times that they're often not questioned. And I believe that our expressions of Washington's greatness sometimes come at her expense. So I want to start with looking at some of the major events of Mary's life. And for some of you, this is review, but I know some folks here haven't been acquainted with Mary. And so these are her events. She's born around 1708. She's married in 1731 to Augustine Washington. They have 6 children together. She becomes a widow in her mid-30s when her husband Augustine dies. And it's Augustine's second marriage. Augustine has 3 surviving children from his first marriage. When Augustine dies, George is only 11. He's the oldest of her children. And she administers the property of her sons until they turn 21. So she doesn't remarry. And by remaining a widow, she has to maintain all those properties until her sons are old enough to do so. In 1754, George moves to Mount Vernon after his older half-brother passed away. And then between 1754 and 1763, the French and Indian War happens. George participates in that and starts making a name for himself militarily. In 1772, Mary's in her mid-60s. That's when she moves into town, into a house that's still standing today, in which I give tours along with a number of other fantastic docents that work there. It's a very gratifying job to have. And then in 1781, during the American Revolution, Mary and her family, Lafayette orders Fredericksburg to be evacuated, and the family flees west to stay with family there. They're there for about 9 months before they're able to return to Fredericksburg. And then in 1789, Mary passes away after a long battle with breast cancer. So let's look at Mary's life, but this time let's look at her decisions, because this is often where biographers find fault with Mary. So by the time she's 13, her parents have passed away, and her stepfather's passed away as well. But at this age, through inheritance, Mary owns property to the tune of 1,000 acres on 2 separate tracts. She has livestock, horses, and at least, at the age of 13, she has 3 enslaved people. Now, because of this wealth, Mary has options. She's not in a hurry to marry, because she can afford to be choosy and to select the best man from her many suitors. Female social historians have looked into widowhood because Mary's in her mid-30s when she becomes a widow, and oftentimes people say, and I hear it, it was typical, it was routine, most women would remarry. However, when you actually look at the data, if women reach their mid-30s and could afford to do so, they tended to remain widows. And Mary's in her mid-30s, she has 5 children. Had she remarried, that new husband would have had complete control over the futures of all her children and kept all the proceeds of those boys' properties until they reached majority. So that decision to remain a widow was a rational one. It was made with some good thoughts in mind, I think, for her children. In 1746, 14-year-old George is encouraged by his older half-brother, Lawrence, to join the British Navy, which Mary dissuades and George honors. I have another slide about that later. And then in the 1760s, there's wig maintenance going on. That Dress for Success article talks about that. A very innovative, hundreds of wig hair curlers from Ferry Farm. We don't find hundreds of wig hair curlers on archaeological sites. Now, part of that is how thorough they're excavating the site there at Ferry Farm. So that's part of it. But another part of it is something's going on there. And so what I offer in that article is that with 4 boys, not all of them are wearing wigs. It's less expensive to maintain the wigs at home. I offer various hypotheses. There's a whole lecture presentation on that I could give as well. In 1761, George wants to sell Ferry Farm. Mary's in her 50s. She's not interested in leaving. George respects that. But then when she reaches her mid-60s in early 1772, that's when she moves into town. So let's look at how these consequential decisions are related in Washington biographies. And so here's an AI image, okay? So I used Microsoft Copilot, and I said, give me an image of Mary Washington in her early 20s, and I want to see some suitors and an appropriate colonial background. So this is what AI produced, okay? So this is before she's married. She's planter class. Her dowry includes horses, cattle, 1,000 acres of land, and at this point, no less than 4 skilled enslaved workers. Now she can enjoy the options that this wealth provides. She doesn't have to accept the first marriage proposal that comes along because there's going to be many. She waits until the right man, Augustine Washington, proposes. And this image reflects the value her contemporaries recognized: youth, assets, and self-determination. Now watch what happens when we move forward in time. The next image shows Mary as described in Washington biographies, which have a different agenda. There we go. So by the 20th century, the same woman at the same age is reframed as an old maid, as a spinster, not because the evidence has changed, but because the narrative needed her to. When she was 22, she was already considered virtually a spinster, rescued from spinsterhood at 27. And that's the thing too, some of these, they just keep adding years to her. And the data again show in the Chesapeake region, being in your mid-20s was not unusual before you got married. No contemporary described Mary as a spinster. Calling a 22-year-old woman an old maid only makes sense if the goal is to intensify Washington's greatness by giving him a problematic mother. Imagine calling a well-connected, financially secure, healthy woman in her early 20s today as a spinster. It's ridiculous. The only reason we entertain the notion that Mary was old in her early 20s is because that lie has been repeated so often and for so long. The irony of Flexner describing Washington's future wife Martha Dandridge Custis as only 26. Which is it, Flexner? Why is Mary an old maid at 22 or 23, but Martha is only 26? Now, Flexner also notes how masculine George is, and he exaggerates this as well. I mean, George was tall and strong. You really don't need to exaggerate it, but Flexner found a way. Very tall for his generation, over 6 feet, with reddish hair and gray-blue eyes. His face massive, his shoulders narrow for his height, but his hands and feet tremendous. George exuded such masculine power as frightens young women, just awakening to the opposite sex. Many biographies of Washington feature the literary conventions of an epic tale, which feature heroes that experience personal growth despite challenges, friction, and conflict. And the death of Washington's father, when George was only 11, was certainly a blow to the family. Now, Augustine anticipated that some might try to separate the children from their mother, and he made certain to state clearly in his will that he wanted Mary to raise the kids. But there's a clause that if the sons from his first marriage don't like the way Mary or stepfather is managing things, they can intervene. So there's your contemporary expression of confidence in Mary. Augustine specifies in the will he wants Mary to raise his children. And apparently Mary considered, here's AI again, helping to illustrate a portion of their lives that isn't easy to do. And that multinational company I work for really pushes me to use AI. So this is a way of practicing. So apparently Mary considered trusting a new husband to administer the estates of her young children too risky. In addition, what if he wasn't good with finances? What if he was abusive? What if he was an alcoholic? Mary knew how to manage property and people. Her parents had taught her. People like George Eskridge had advised her from a young age. And despite this evident success, biographers found fault with Mary's decision to remain a widow and assumed that Washington's life would have been easier with any stepfather that they could imagine. Now let's consider Ron Chernow's treatment of Mary in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Washington. Now, you don't have to read every word. Just notice the accumulation. These adjectives are from one book for which Ron Chernow was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in history. One adjective might be dismissed. Dozens feel like proof. This is how character gets destroyed. So here's AI with the Ron Chernow's Mary Washington. This is how character gets destroyed, not through one piece of evidence or one expression, but through inundation. Mary's harshest critics were especially prolific in the 20th century, a time when the nation considered some consequential social issues affecting families, including women's employment and suffrage. Many women entered the workforce, earning an income which brought greater responsibilities and independence, and some campaigned for voting rights. Now, I had Copilot create an image of suffragists, and it was a little confused, but I kept it in anyway. Like, what is in the AI sausage that came up with this? And notice suffrage has rage in it too, which I might just adopt. So clearly confusing times. These roles and rights granted greater freedom for women in the 20th century, and I think these national events and major social changes influenced some biographers in the 20th century. And so they found fault with Mary when she's making decisions or being independent, when she exercises authority or personal judgment, like by discouraging George from joining the Navy, which happened in 1746. George is only 14. It's a typical career choice for second sons like George. Remember, his father had sons from his first marriage, so they're inheriting the family plantations. His mother discourages this option, and he complies. And you know, George he lives at Mount Vernon. When he's visiting family in the Northern Neck, he's not sailing down here. It doesn't seem to me like the sea or the water calls to George. So I don't, a lot of the biographers really find fault and said Mary was being really selfish in this decision. It's certainly a matter of opinion. In 1965, James Flexner shared this quote from one of Washington's childhood friends, carefully omitting the second half, and many of you are familiar with this quote. I was 10 times more afraid than I ever was of my own parents. And he stops the quote there, but that quote goes on to say that she awed me in the midst of her kindness, for she was indeed truly kind. I mean, Flexner omitting that is really egregious because it represents a deliberate choice and one designed to intensify contempt for Washington's mother. These are the various places that Mary lived in her life. She starts down at Forest Plantation. That's what it's referred to in her father's will. I'm going to go and I'm going to try to shout from there so I can point. Forest Plantation, where her father's plantation is. Then she marries Augustine. They move to Pope's Creek. Then they move up to what's today Fairfax County, to Mount Vernon. There she has John Augustine and Charles. And then she moves to Ferry Farm in Fredericksburg. And then she moves across the river. Those two little balloons overlap too closely to show them separately. And then in the red dotted line, I show the move to the western parts of Virginia, to today's West Virginia, where they had to flee when Lafayette ordered Fredericksburg to be evacuated. Cornwallis had his sights on Fredericksburg. The gunnery was here. There was an iron forge here that he was after, and some think that he may have been after some of Washington's family members as well. Once he hears that the town's been evacuated, Cornwallis gives up the idea of coming to Fredericksburg. The trip was arduous. Hang on, we went backwards. Why did we go backwards? Coming. There we go. The trip was arduous. Mary and her daughter Betty and her Betty's husband Fielding and some of the grandkids go with them. This would have been, really rough terrain to travel at this time. And the family, there would have been like 4 generations living under one roof. And they're there for some amount of time. When I first heard of this, I thought they were gone for like a month. It's close to 9 months that the family is gone, while they waited for word that they could return back to Fredericksburg. And during this time, Betty's husband Fielding dies. Mary's son Samuel Washington dies. It was a very difficult time. When Mary wrote to her son George, at this point she's in her 70s, so she's enduring all this travel and close quarters and war in her 70s. And she wrote to George in 1782 saying, quote, "This trip over the mountain has almost killed me." And just seeing those mountains, I can tell you, I grew up in this area, the northern part of Virginia. When I moved to Lexington to teach at Washington and Lee, those mountains are really alarming because for me, they got in the way of the vision. I couldn't see the horizon because these mountains were in the way. So, and I never got used to that, So Ron Chernow found a great deal to criticize in Mary's letter to George. He noted that, quote, "Her few letters are replete with spelling errors, dispense with all grammar and punctuation, and confirm the impression of an unlettered countrywoman." Sounds like she's ahead of her time, like texts are like this, But of course, as many of you know, spelling wasn't standardized. And let's look at what she's expressing. During the Revolutionary War, Mary hadn't heard from her son George for 7 years. And if the British had ever captured him, he would have absolutely been killed. So 7 years of praying at Meditation Rock, of hoping for his safety. And then to find out that he went through town while she was still out west and that she just missed him by a matter of weeks. What is she expressing here? Urgency, affection, suffering, and appreciation for the 25 guineas that he left her. Mary's misspelled words were by design. She lived in a society which considered reading and writing for women as unnecessary, as an ornament, an indulgence, even amongst the planter class. In Mary, we see a victim of a society which considered education a privilege and one that women did not deserve. So criticizing her for misspelling seems especially cruel. Now here's the double standard laid bare. Washington's spelling errors are corrected seamlessly, while Mary's are presented as evidence of yet another deficiency. Unfortunately, defamation of Mary's character has left a residue that has permeated children's books. This illustration from a children's book sends a cruel message to a vulnerable audience. A dedicated mother, grandmother, community member, and patriot is a gross caricature. Mary Washington didn't like it when George was away too long. He describes George as being the man of the house at 11 years old. Now, this is a different children's book. And the language has intensified. She could hardly read or write. She gave lots of orders. This capable, hardworking mother portrayed as a villain in George's life. And these images distilled careless narrative, bias, and sloppy scholarship into inaccurate lessons for children. Now, finally tonight, I want to share an idea I have about Mary's signature. So you can see, you look at historical documents and you see lots of variety of Mary's signature. And this is because a number of those documents, sometimes the original doesn't survive, and what you're looking at is a transcribed copy. So you can see those bottom three are all Mary's will, and clearly those are three different hands making those signatures. So I just, as an exercise, wanted to see if I could figure out which was actually her signature. And I wasn't sure I'd be able to be successful at this when I set out to do it. And so I thought, let's look at personal correspondence. And I'm really lucky, a lot of institutions have been scanning their documents and putting them online. So this, I think, this is a personal correspondence that Mary has. And I believe Mary personally signed this. And I want you to look at that W. That's a really odd W. Have you seen a W like that before? I think I know why she did it that way. But let's go forward in time, continuing to go through personal correspondence. Here's a 1760 letter to her brother. Note the consistency of this distinctive signature. This is a unique expression. 1776 letter to Lund, Washington. He's managing Mount Vernon while George is at war. This signature is not the creation of a confused or deficient mind. This isn't because she's not well educated. These are not just for her signature, but it's any time a W is written. So to Lund, Washington, she does the same little special part there. It's consistent. It's a 1785 letter to her son, John Augustine. She's in her late 70s, but this signature is not infirmity brought on by old age. This is not ignorance. It's consistent. It's unique. This is not because she's an unlettered countrywoman. This is creative, deliberate, and intentional. There's one more signature I want to show you. And you can see it for yourself if you go to the Mary Washington House on 1200 Charles Street, and it's her maiden name. This is her book of meditations that she owned before she got married, that she, yes, I'm seeing people are getting it right now, that she signed before she got married. And then we can look. I think that B in ball is influencing that W. Again, her book of meditations is on display at Mary Washington House. You should come see it for yourself. We can't know why Mary created such an unusual W, but I think that left wing of the W is an homage to her family name, Ball. Consider the B of her maiden signature, so I just recopied it there over all those places. So just an idea I had. Might she be honoring or remembering her name each time she signs her name, each time she makes a W? At the very least, we can say Mary's unusual W is deliberate, creative, and independent. And we're really fortunate that the family preserved Mary's book of meditations. And after all this time, our understanding of Mary and the Washingtons is evolving. I'm really pleased at all these institutions, all these documents I could get to online. And so to contribute to these new insights. We are not done learning about this family. Now, one remedy to Mary's detractors is place-based interpretation, seeing what survives, how it's interpreted, and how it inspires. And the Washington Heritage Museum administers her Fredericksburg home, where she lived the last 17 years of her life. It's at 1200 Charles Street. It's open daily. There's a lovely garden, and there's a gift shop as well. And the garden and the kitchen are free. So if you're on a budget, you can come look at the garden and the kitchen for nothing, but do stop in the lobby so we can get credit for your presence there, because we keep track of how many people visit us, so please do that. General Lafayette visited Mary here during the Revolutionary War in late March 1781 to ask for Mary's blessing. And Lafayette came to Fredericksburg specifically because he wanted to meet Washington's mother. So you can, in one place, see where Washington came, where Mary lived, where Lafayette came, where so many revolutionary patriots came. So in conclusion, you've made it, people. Surviving evidence is subject to interpretation and too sparse for certainty. And this should urge caution, not unfounded speculation. Widows by their nature were independent. They had to be frugal and commanding. Mary's image as a harsh, selfish, and illiterate person reveals more about the capricious and imaginative myth-building of Washington's biographers than it does about Mary. So I ask you, how should museums label Mary? How should children's books change? What does Mary's life teach us about women's life in early America and the significance and consequences of the narratives that we share? I admire Washington's mother, Mary, and I admit I'm biased because I appreciate how hard it is to maintain a house and how much time that takes and how it's taken for granted. And I don't even have kids. And this does not mean I dislike George. So at work, we had a meeting in February, and they always start with February birthdays, and there were no February birthdays. And so I said, George Washington. And my supervisor said, I didn't think you liked George. And it's just like, oh my gosh. You know, and why does it have to be one or the other? I love George. I love his story. So if you thought history was all in the past, finished and agreed upon, I hope tonight's presentation inspires you to reconsider and perhaps revisit some past events and places. If you haven't been to the Mary Washington House lately, there's a new tour that's being done. And of course, that gift shop is always worth a visit. And the garden is looking better than ever. You've been a very gracious audience. Thank you for coming tonight and for watching as this kept getting canceled and rescheduled, so thank you. I had to cut a lot out of, this presentation was 88 slides long in January. I had to cut a lot. So if you liked what you heard, let the organizers know. I can come back with other topics about Mary that I had to cut for this presentation. So thank you so much for coming. Maybe there are questions. I see young Aaron.
Yeah. Do you have a biography of Mary Washington that you would recommend for people?
Well, Martha Saxton's is good. It's very good. But even I think she's a little hard on Mary. But that's really good. If you're on a budget, Michelle Hamilton wrote one that's just sort of, that concentrates on the primary documents about Mary. But Martha Saxton, rest in peace, wrote a great biography, and you can find that at the gift shop at the Mary Washington House, certainly. And she was a professor at Princeton, and she lectured a great deal on women's history, so she understood the context, the society in which Mary was navigating. So, any other questions or comments? I know there's a lot of, yes, young Holly. There's not a lot. So Joseph Ball and Mary Johnson, she was married Mary Johnson was married a number of times. There's some indication that Mary's mother came here as an indentured servant. And then Joseph Ball, it was his second marriage, and he was a little elderly, and it caused a little concern amongst his children that he was marrying an indentured servant, and I think someone that had been part of his household before. So there's not a lot known about her parents, especially about her mother. And I want to say something about Augustine Washington, because we don't know a lot about Augustine Washington, but one of the things I think of that I think indicates he was a generous man was the naming of his children. And so in his first marriage to Jane Butler, does anyone know the name of Augustine's first son that died in childhood? His first son's name was Butler, which was his wife's maiden name. And I think that was quite generous of him to do that. And then his daughter's name in that marriage was Jane. And then if you look at the names in his second marriage, George was probably named for George Eskridge, was someone important to Mary. Betty was likely named for Mary's half-sister Elizabeth. And then Samuel is was a brother-in-law. And so Augustine seems to be allowing his wives to have a lot of influence in the naming of children, especially his first son being named Butler. I thought that was really generous. So we don't know a lot about Augustine, but that to me is a little insight into the man he was. Okay, more questions, corrections, edits. I saw this hand first.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
I recall reading of some friction between George and Mary over money, harassing him for money. Any insight on that?
So Mary does ask for money, but it's a society that puts women in that position, that dependency. And then I've heard from some other scholars, local scholars, that say George, the money that was made from her 400-acre property in Stafford County, 2 miles down from Ferry Farm, went to George and then he distributed it to her. So I haven't looked into that a lot, but it definitely offends people that she needs to ask for money. I haven't looked into that a lot, but people are critical of that. And so I can't, that doesn't offend me. If someone needs money and they need to, and I tell you, George is providing money to all his family, and even to strangers whose sons want to go to college. He's giving money for that. Samuel Washington, who has 5 wives, needs a lot of help after he dies. And so people are squeezing George for money all the time. I don't see biographers complaining about anybody else asking George for money. So I think there's something there as well. There seems to be something, but she lives to be 82. There's a couple of, things that say she was 82. She was at least 80. She's gonna need help. So I understand that she could need money and need help. So, yes.
Do you think that the fact that Mary Washington opposed the revolution and was a loyalist had anything to do with the denigration of her reputation?
I don't know. I also heard that she, did some sewing for the cause. Bacon was impressed for the revolutionary soldiers. So what's the evidence that she's a loyalist?
I thought that there were letters or records of her encouraging George not to rebel. No?
I don't know. Does anyone else know details about that? So it would make sense. Oh, young Kevin.
Just real quick, I don't remember the French officer's name.
Yes.
They were marching back, I think from Yorktown. He said they were going to stop at Mary's house. Heard she was a Tory, and they kept going. That's the only thing I've ever found.
Right, and heard that she was a Tory. Like, who's telling them that? And are they pranking the French generals just for fun? So I don't know, and I'm interested in that. But she does, I understand, make things, textiles and stuff, and see, I'm way out of my area of expertise, but that she made things for the revolutionary cause. And when Lafayette orders the town to be evacuated, she leaves. She's not putting out the flag and welcoming Cornwallis and throwing out roses. But the family may have forced her, so I feel like those details just aren't well known enough. and I'm biased.
This is, received information. It's not from any primary source.
And I was prepared, like if someone has that primary source, I do want to hear about it for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think we know enough about it. And there are certainly Tories in town. Westwood on the James River, the British are welcomed there. That beautiful mansion is still standing. So there are Tories in the neighborhoods. So I don't know what to say about that, and I'm biased. Okay, yes, sir.
Do we know much about her siblings?
Do we know much about her siblings? There's a little, but there's not a whole heck of a lot. And she doesn't have any full siblings. So her dad has some siblings from earlier and from an earlier marriage. And she keeps the Ball family is close-knit. And the Washingtons and the Balls have lots of kin in the neighborhood, but I haven't studied them extensively. Way in the back.
I would say that I think Martha Saxon in her book gives some
Yes, you're right.
about the siblings.
Yes, you're right.
Going into some good relations about insight into Mary and what influences she had growing up. So I would say read Martha Saxon's book.
Yes, yes.
This lady's been waiting for a while.
Oh, please.
Do you know where Mary and Augustus met, or how they met, or where they met?
No, they probably met, they probably knew of one another for a while. The question was, how'd they meet? Apocryphally, I've heard that George Eskridge introduces them, and there's good reason for that because Mary's dowry property, she had 600 acres that adjoined an iron mine in which both Augustine and George Eskridge were partners in. And so, George Eskridge may have said, hey, take a look at Mary, you marry her and you get to that 600 acres. And they probably, those families would have been close. Both the Ball family and the Washington family came to Virginia in the 1650s for the same political reasons. They didn't like the how the monarchy was working in England, and so they came to Virginia. And so they may have known of one another for quite some time. He probably visited her at her home, or there may have been some events at which they were both at. Yes, absolutely. Yes, good point.
When Ron Chernow came and spoke at Great Barns,
Yes.
there were people in the audience who gave him a hard time about what he said about Mary, because they had read things and things. Other things besides pillars that were found at Great Barns that have some more insight into
And so lots of tea wares, and this is a way of where men and young women, and especially unmarried people, can meet and get to know one another. The utensils there are a lot of forks there, and forks don't seem like a big deal to us now, but when forks came to Europe from Greece, Turkey, that area, and the first people in Europe that were used forks were excommunicated because it was a violation of vanity. And that's like in the 1500s. Early knives in the colonial era had points to them. So you didn't need a fork, you just poked it with the knife and you put that knife in your mouth with its point. And people were feeding their babies, like, you stick a knife with a point and you stick it in your baby's mouth. And so Ferry Farm seems to have lots and lots of forks. And so the dining etiquette that they would have learned, how to use forks, how to have tea, the textiles, so there's evidence for tambour work being done at Ferry Farm, and it was very early for tambour work to be happening in Virginia, for it to happen at Ferry Farm. And so that's another ornament. As a gentry class lady, that's for Betty to be doing that tambour work. It's fancy needlework. It's a way of Betty sort of showing her elegance and an exotic talent. Women to attract men needed to dance or sing, play an instrument, and do fancy needlework. So those are some of the things and the clothing. And so the clothing is economical, but it's fashionable. You can see those buckles changing through the decades. They're keeping up with fashions. So those are some of the things off the top of my head. Yes, sir.
About the theory that she opposed the revolution. She had opposed his joining the British Navy. How does she feel about his pursuing a military career in the Army, in the colonies? Is there any information about how she felt about his? During the French and Indian War, she writes a letter to her brother saying, boy, George is, when he's finally back and situated at Mount Vernon, she writes her brother who lives in England, Joseph Ball, and he said he's finally given that up now. So basically, she worries about him in those military pursuits a lot. She'd probably prefer that he not do them, but again, it is a traditional career for those, after those first sons get the land and most of the property, that primogeniture, I'm probably mispronouncing that. Military comes next, and then you get down to Charles, the youngest, who goes into the service, religious service. So military is spot on what he should be doing. So she may have sort of been resigned to that, but I can understand why she wouldn't like it, that she was frightened for him. And he writes a letter, and many of you are probably familiar with it, where he talks about how exciting it is. The bullets are whizzing around him, and like 2 horses are shot out from under him, and he writes this letter to his mom. I mean, I can't imagine how frightening that was to read. And how, as a man in his 20s, that sense of immortality, that he had at that time, that would have quickly changed after some of those battles he was part of later on. Okay, folks, it's been a long night, and I can still talk with folks. Thanks so much for coming, and go to support those historic sites, dig up those biographies you haven't read for a while, go to the library and look at some of those early texts, and discover something new, as simple as Mary's signature. Thank you.